So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services are refined in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yeshayahu the prophet, we find in the 61st chapter of Yeshayahu a layer of understanding related with the spring feast. Spring feast means the holy feasts established by the Creator Himself when His people they were on a desert. Then Moses received these instructions, and these instructions are found then on Leviticus the 23rd chapter from the 1st verse until the 21st verse. Thus the spring feast. Then Yeshayahu in the 61st chapter also mentioned the autumn feast. It is the second half of the instructions, where you find then from the 23rd verse until the 44th verse. The 22nd verse is then the understanding of the entire Megillah or writing of Ruth, related with then Gentiles. Then, as Yeshayahu the prophet was explaining also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries, from a time where not even the spring feast was completed. The spring feast was further yet 500 years at least from the time of Yeshayahu. And then, obviously, he explained not only the spring feast, he explained then the time of the kingship of the Messiah, he explained then the time of the seat, he explained the time of the autumn feast. We have to understand this factor. There are many other writings of Yeshayahu, and a lot of them were destroyed. It is absolutely certain what Yeshayahu had done, and he knew the time of the deceit, where then his people would get mixed up with the world for a time. And then later would be the restoration period, and then he explains this factor. Yeshayahu was extremely important prophet, and he explained detail after detail, precise information regarding the events of not only tabernacling, but also of the Gentile level. Yeshayahu is extremely important also because not only he explained both of them at the same time, he had also explained his people what went on during the time of the politics. So he was explaining the politics of the time, he was explaining yet the spring feast coming, he was explaining then the autumn feast, he was explaining the time of the restoration period. Not only this, he explained then the restoration of the cities from a time where not even the spring feast was completed. Yeshayahu is extremely important also because as you read, you find at least first, second, and third layers, namely then the Gentile level, tabernacling, and then what went on during the politics of his time. So sometimes when you read a certain area of Yeshayahu, you must understand the content, the context. Because depending of the words used by Yeshayahu, the understanding is a time of the future related with a geographical area of what went on during his time. Try to understand. Tabernacling during the time of Yeshayahu was contaminated. Yeshayahu was a person at times. He was explaining from tabernacling, while he himself did not have the tabernacling perfectly in order. So try to understand, you must be very acquainted with tabernacling, so then you understand when Yeshayahu speaks. He speaks sometimes from tabernacling, while he was not there. Because if you are a historian, you can understand, then temple, for instance, it was never in order. Tabernacling was in order. So more than often than not, Yeshayahu spoke as tabernacling. We can't say these every time, otherwise the Creator would be then mixed up with Yeshayahu. Though he was, as far as giving instructions, but he was not tabernacling himself. So then you make the distinction and understand each layer as per then the explanation of the prophet. However, you can find further refinement of Yirmiyahu during the time of Daniel. Daniel makes more delineated because he was outside of the perimeter of Jerusalem. Yerushalayim was very contaminated during the time, and then there was a lot of political problems and mixed up with religion, mixed up with the people of the law. So when Yirmiyahu would speak, there were these layers at the same time. So you have to understand how to read it. But then the information becomes clearer later when you read then Daniel and Ezekiel, because they were in exile. So their minds, they were more prone for fixing their tasks only as far as Gentile and as far as tabernacling. They became more defined because the spiritual area was decongested. Try to understand. But then during this time, we are simply understanding what Yirmiyahu said, lining up also with Daniel, lining up also with Ezekiel. Each layer must be harmonized. There are other documents. Some of the documents were destroyed. But because a person studies tabernacling and the events via what Shaliach Shaul said, as far as times and the seasons, you do not have to be taught. As long as we understand times and seasons, Leviticus the 23rd chapter, and then frame time from then on, each year practicing the same feasts. Then you find the feasts themselves until the Messiah came. Then later you find then the shadow prophetic events of the instructions based from Leviticus the 23rd chapter. So then we find ourselves then studying most of the transitional time. That's where you get your, in quote, New Testament. It doesn't exist. The main understanding is the completion of the spring feast. And then what you understand also is Ruach HaKodesh came and he inhabited his people, so then later they clustered and formed then a holy city. The holy city, the first holy city, was during the time of Yohanan. Then Yohanan gathered the documents available of the time. Then he organized them layered. Yohanan had the privilege of having the entire complete instructions perfectly in order. He had every aspect of the scripture. But then how do we know this? How do we understand? We must understand Nahashatan, he's not stupid. He observes from afar. Though he can't enter the perimeter of the holy cities, because the cities are holy. The perimeter is holy. He can't enter. In his spirit or in person. He can't enter the holy cities. So try to understand. Simultaneously with tabernacling, then there is the Gentile world's time. You have times and seasons, and you have the time of the Gentiles. How do we know then that Yohanan was then for a time in the first holy city? It's very simple. In the spiritual world of the Gentile means outside of the holy cities. The time is count not as the same as on the holy cities. So then, the Mayan calendar, for some time, many people thought the world was going to end in 2012. Ridiculous. So the understanding was, obviously, the ending of the 1,000 years of deceit ended in 2009. The spiritual world of the time when Yohanan entered the first holy city, obviously he stayed in there for at least 36 months. That's where you find the discrepancy from 09 until 12. Nahashatan simply was waiting outside of the gates. He couldn't do anything. There were no directives. When the first holy city of the Messiah was then set up, time, in quote, had halted itself. Nahashatan was outside, waiting for some sort of directive. Had any? Didn't have any. Only after 36 months, when then Yohanan gathered those documents. Try to understand, he had the original manuscripts from the prophets, from the law, then the writings of those who were enlightened by Ruach HaKodesh, and he gathered them. He layered them. Layered very precisely, very simply. Then the world during this time, they were in the limbo. The spiritual world of the time, they were in a limbo. So then Yohanan, during these 36 months in the first holy city, what went on? We find then the Messiah obviously explaining while in the first holy city. How do we know this? Because 7 cities were in sin. Those cities of Asia Minor were in sin, were they not? That's what you read then in Revelation. But Yohanan couldn't ever be very precise of what he was talking if he had not put together these documents perfectly himself. He had to get the entire content and context up to his time. He became the example of the other holy cities. So then, as he entered a safe place where Nahashatan was never and ever entered the holy city, he had to wait outside. The calendars of the world, besides then the holy city, they were counting themselves. But Nahashatan knew Yohanan was there, and he was holding the spiritual organization of his time, while there were other countings around the world. So in the spiritual realm, we find a gap of 36 months. This was the time that had taken Yohanan. How do we know this? Because when you study the holy instructions, firstly, you find the Messiah was born then in 4999. If you start the counting from 0, then it's 3999. In Hebrew culture, when you are born, you are already a year old. So 1,000, couple thousand, and so on and so forth. He was born then 4999. If you count per Hebrew. If you count as Gentile, then 3999. So then, he lived obviously until 5032. That was then his age. When he was placed on a pole, prior of the event, he spent time with the Samaritans for a couple Yom Creation days. That's where it starts your calculation. Extremely simple. There is a section from Shimon explaining, and then 1,000 years with, God is like a day, and a day like 1,000 years. It's what it meant, because he spent time with the Samaritans, and he was on Mount Gerizim, or Mountain of the Favor. The Messiah was taking tabernacling from Jerusalem and starting his tabernacling outside of Jerusalem, never done before. So when you read Yeshayahu, then chapter 1:8, you find the word Ushkni. Chapter 1:8 of Yeshayahu. You can go by the numbers. Chapter 1:8 is layered with the 61st. Those are related. However, there are sections of it that are not. So the translators, they did not have a clue what they were doing. What they had in front of them were then a pile of these documents, and they had no clue how to read them. So then when you understand the returning of the cities of the Messiah later ways for many centuries, and then in the land of Cush, then you begin your quest with tabernacling. So then, Yohanan was there then 36 months. In 09 ended the time of the 1,000 years of the city. How do we know? The Messiah spent time with Samaritans, 50-32. Because prior of his destruction, he was in Samaria, or then on the top of the Mount Gerizim. On the top of this mountain, he transfigured himself. It was absolutely important having then the main figures of the scripture, Moshe and Eliyahu. Understandably, law and the prophets outside of Jerusalem. Because the Messiah was showing the world his 1,000 years. Though truly started when he was born. But his tabernacling would be then set up a few decades later. So he went to Samaria, the Mount Gerizim, Mount of Favor. The Messiah was the favored. He went up on a mountain. There he transfigured himself. Showed up to him Moshe and Eliyahu. Then he came down. Those couple of young creation days from 50-32, he gave 2 days to the Gentiles. We are Gentiles. Non-Hebrews are Gentiles. From 50-32, then you obviously then count another couple thousand years. 50-32 plus 2,000, 70-32. What a year is ours? 70-13. You know what this means? 70-32 is the maximum time given by the Messiah during his time. So the prophecy ends in 70-32. The calculation is very simple. You begin your quest understanding Daniel of a time and a half a time and so on and so forth, and those times. You don't have to be concerned with those. Yet maybe you should if you are interested in learning, for instance, the number of Shabbats, and then related with the feasts, times and the seasons, understandably. But you can start your quest, these further study, when you know then the end of it. From 70-32, whatsoever is spoken must end at that time. Only make space in your calculations because the Messiah is in the 24th chapter of Metishiahu, or the first gospel, or the first writing of the spring feast's completion. The reduction of time in the 24th chapter. If it wasn't then for the reduction of the time, then they would not survive. So there is a reduction of time. We don't know how long is going to be this reduction, but we know it's from 70-32. Could be 5 years, could be a couple of years, could be 10. We don't know. But we know there is a reduction of time. So from 50-32, we understand that he was born in 49-99. And then maximum time given to this world is 70-32. From 70-32, you then do your calculations from 70-32 until the time when the prophet spoke. Then you have to calculate times and the seasons. Then it's a bit more complicated. But at the moment, since the cities are returning in the first holy city on the land of Cush, that's why then, Yeshayahu 1:8, you find the word Yushkini. Yushkini is a cipher word. You have to understand the content and the context so then you can give a specific word regarding tabernacling outside of Jerusalem. So whatsoever the word the prophet Yeshayahu spoke, it's not Mishkan. It is a combination of the first tabernacle service and the second. So when you read the menorahs, the two menorahs, in Revelation you understand, the first menorah is the first service. The second menorah is after Yohanan. The second menorah. First and second menorahs combined. And these first and second menorahs combining, they are returning. First city on the land of Cush. So then, when the Messiah, he went up on the top of the mountain of favor, he opened the seals. So when you read Revelation, the only section left is the sounding of the shofars. It's the only section lacking. When you understand spring feast, you have an understanding of the Messiah coming and completing the spring feast. When you speak of autumn feast, you are talking of vengeance. So then you have to understand both of them at the same time. So then when you read Revelations, parts of it do not belong in Revelation. They belong in the spring feast. The earthquake, for instance, of Revelation belongs to the spring feast. It is the same earthquake. When the Messiah was placed on a pole and it was a time for him then to leave his body, what went on? And then the rocks split. The Ark of the Covenant was below the Messiah. His holy dam came down and then anointed the Most Holy. That's where you read Daniel the 9th chapter. Then comes the earthquake. So the earthquake is the same earthquake when you read the spring feast and when you read Revelation. However, it's not part of the autumn feast. The translators were mistaken. The first, second, and third chapters of Revelation, they do not belong there. Those are during the time of restoration. We are during the time of the restoration. So first, second, and third chapters belong in our time. Chapter 1:8 of Revelation is when prior of starting the services. Some chapters of Revelation belongs to post-autumn feast, when the new capital then comes from heaven. So only a portion of it related with the sounding of shofars. Then you understand autumn feast. And obviously the extension of the shofars are the cups. Shofars are sounded because of the consequences of sin coming from Nahashatan. The completion of the judgment of each sound ends with the Creator Himself. Those are His vengeance. So then when the Messiah came down from the mountain, he had the seals opened. These crazy people, pastors, teachers, trying to speak, and then all because we don't know what's in Revelation. Oh yes, we do know. We must know, otherwise you can't be revealed. The only situation lacking is the sounding of the shofars, the starting of autumn feast. So those horses and so on and so forth, those are already opened. From the time when the Messiah spoke until our time, you find those are already opened. You have to study the content and the context of the instructions, and then you understand the spiritual levels and the flow of these events. When Autumn Feast comes, then the sounding of the shofars. Then we are speaking of the Autumn Feast. Because the translators, they mixed up the entire scripture. They had taken part of it with what did not belong, then they put numbers that don't belong. They tried to read a section of it that didn't understand. They mixed up the numbers. It is absolutely a salad. We are during the time of the restoration period of the first transitional time. What is the first transitional time? It is living from the time of the seat 09 and then entering the time of the restoration period back on a schedule. Thus, shifting from devil, deceit, mockery, and then dragon, precision. Dragon is not a bad term. In fact, the dragon is the purest form you can ever find in the Gentile level. It's pure precision. Then there is another transition on a Gentile level itself, where then the stick of authority of the trade of the existing world is given to the Ishmaelites. Those were promises. The Ishmaelites are then on the second section of Yeshayahu. Where do you find? The 61st chapter explains the feasts and the returning of the cities of the Messiah, tabernacling. The 62nd chapter, or the second section of it, you find then the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites, they use turbans. Hebrews, they don't use turbans. They use veil. So the Hebrews, they scandalize the scripture for their own benefit. Thus, takanot. So be familiar with takanot masim. There are sections and scores of scripture that were removed related with the Ishmaelites. So then, during this time, we find ourselves then lining up the countries with the trade of the end. As we understand and was explained before, Cancun has then the dragon marked. The dragon is showing itself thus far in a very simplistic part of it. A huge section of trade. The dragon is already showing itself. But it's not online yet. Not purely dragon, not yet. But then the objective of these Cancun, it's not only tourism, it is a trading post of the Americas. However, if you then watch the video of it, you find then the stretching of the dragon from Cancun to the tip of South America. That's not very realistic. The dragon is not stupid of stretching itself so far down south. It's not economical. And then linking up with the north, as far as the northern Canada, non-economical. But we do understand during this time, where then prior of September of this year, where the BRICS countries are coming in order to further their plans, yet advancing forward. It's going to be in the Soviet Union. If you don't listen to the Soviet Union with a nice smile yet, then you should, because the Soviet Union was activated last month. If you board an aircraft from the Soviet Union at the moment, you find the ladies over there, they are in red and they wear the hat with the Soviet Union symbol. So then, September, we can expect that the world will change. In what form? More delineation of the plan of the trade of the end. BRICS. What do they want? How can they start launching the system? China has lots of raw materials. They have enough materials for the launching of the system, but lacks delineation. What does it mean? Having, for instance, a trading post of the Americans in Cancun. It's not realistic. Does provide for Central America a great trading post, understandably. But it can't stretch so far as the tip of South America. It's not realistic. So obviously what the countries of the BRICS, they would want themselves, or will want themselves, is a dragon mart in their own countries. Obviously. That's the whole system of the dragon. So the system of Cancun, then implemented in India, implemented in South Africa, implemented in Brazil. And then more than likely Canada. And obviously in the South Pacific, Australia. So in September, it is a very important month. You watch very closely what's going to come out of the BRICS. Further delineation, because you have a couple of armies of the world joining up. And their objective is protecting those people doing direct trade with the dragon. Obviously. We are during the time of the dragon, and the dragon is showing himself he would provide protection for his own system. But then if you study further in Moscow Times, you have found in a company, they are making a deal and they're going to start constructing an airfield only for freight. 21,000 square meters. So begin then your understanding of the time of the transition, and understand then what it means coming out of deceit, disorganization, and then on a time of the dragon. What can you conclude? The model on Mexico obviously is going to be used in other places. Because they already have the infrastructure, they have already a blueprint. It doesn't mean that it won't change, but then they have the bulk of it. And this is what it is then required for the launching of the BRICS system. And the most favorable place of this planet at the moment is Australia. It is a power beyond imagination. Besides then China, besides the Soviet Union, and besides Africa, Australia can become the fourth. Have in mind, Australia is not on Daniel 11, neither on the Apocrypha, because it does not mention South Pacific or any other area other than East, China, Dragon, North, Soviet Union, and then South, then is Africa. But then, the flow of trade, when you understand, besides not asking a true prophet of the holy city, not available yet. So then we have to have another recourse of understanding the events or the flow of trade. You have a huge vast of air in the South Pacific where then they are solely themselves. And they are nearly straight north from China. Extremely privileged area. Not only this, there are vast number of islands near Australia. where they have lots of gold, raw materials, minerals of many kinds. So a trading post of the South Pacific would make Australia, with no doubt, at least the fourth, if they understand how to do the work. Then obviously it would have a big competition with Brazil, because the Amazon is extremely rich. But because of the tradition of the Balian system, started then with England, there are the steps of formation in the spirit. Obviously Australia would be favored of starting these trade besides than those who are so evident, for instance Mexico. But with Mexico there is a problem. Cancun is a very nice area, as you can watch from the computer. But then big ships coming from China, more than likely these are returning empty. There are not much mining going on around Cancun. So you'll find post-Panamax ships coming with logistics and products and such, and then returning empty. Except for northern Brazil, where they can find lots of minerals. But then Brazil wants the share for itself. Since northern Brazil is very close to Cancun, then having another Dragon Mart so near, it wouldn't be very wise. But if you use then a Dragon Mart in South Brazil, then it would serve then the South Atlantic. Then those vast mines of the Amazon, obviously they would get the ores, smelter, and they have the metals then absolutely neatly organized. So then the post-Panamax, when they come with products, they can return to China with raw materials. But Australia is very fortunate because not only they are very privileged, but then they have the tourism. They have a huge, vast area of the Pacific, extremely important for tourism. So you combine Dragon Mart, you combine the freighters, because being a trading post of the South Pacific, those islands around them must be served with parcels. So not only this, then they make a deal with the freighters. Not only this, they have to come up with the air freight airstrip for themselves. Not only this, but they have to come up with buildings for the storage of their parcels. Not only this, they have to start then the distribution center of their own. And it doesn't stop there either, because they have to have a fuel depot. But it doesn't stop there either, because then these minerals coming from the other islands that can be smelted on Australia and then sent to China. But that doesn't stop there either. Then their own education system, providing then the best salaries for their people, they will obviously demand at least 5 years of service as technician level. With these huge understanding and potential for the change of the huge power of the South Pacific, they will demand at least 5 years of their students and then obviously do the work in their own country. Let's say, for instance, a person wants to become a higher up in electricity, serves as technician for 5 years, or the time required by their government until they get a university diploma. Let's say if they have to study 10 years, they do the service of 10 years as a technician level. They serve their country during the time of their study and working at the same time. So then they won't end up like New Zealand. For instance, they have very important universities where then they pay for the students, but then when the students they get their diploma, then they leave the country. So New Zealand is not served with those people that they trained. Is a potential beyond imagination of any politician ever. Now, obviously, the Creator is involved. That's why we should push for the holy city in the land of Cush, because it must have a prophet, so then this world becomes then organized. You find this visit in September is extremely important. If they would realize what this visit is requiring of people, we can read from their own G20 website and become more acquainted with it. The first objective is very simple: growth through quality jobs and investment. The second objective, growth through trust and transparency. Only computer can do this. Obviously, Daniel said, knowledge would increase for the purposes of trade. You have to use computers. And growth through comprehensive regulation. When you understand then what China is doing as far as the Dragon Mart and their system of the end, where you combine then the yuan of China with gold, paper money, regulation from the central bank, and a system not regulated by the central bank. Yet a unit of a virtual monetary system where you can purchase. If you understand Bitcoin, you understand it. The only distinction is it's backed up by production. And when you understand the stockpiles of raw materials of China, then you can be absolutely safe. If you buy then a virtual monetary system of China, because it's backed up by production, you are covered. For some people, it does not make any sense, because they were never brought up with layers of understanding. Neither they have no interest in learning the holy instructions. They don't want to learn then the holy feasts. They think the instructions were abolished. Only half of it was completed. How can they say then the instructions were abolished? Understandably then, we find in Cancun then the first Dragon Mart of the Americas. Thus your role model. But this time, not only then Australia has an extremely important role, and they only have to copy the blueprint, and then combine with their own freighters, making a deal with their own freighters, combining then with a fuel depot and expansion of their ports, and then distribution center of the South Pacific. In order for these to become economical, post-Panamax ships coming from China, when they deliver their cargo in the South Pacific, obviously they want to return to China with raw materials. It is as obvious as you can ever imagine. Because the new system in the computer requires raw materials gathering constantly. Infrastructure, the rebuilding. And Australia has a privilege because they are around many islands, and some of them are even French. And becoming a distribution center of the entire vast area of the Pacific, it is a lot of money. Only the evaluation of the geographical area, raw materials, and making a deal with those islanders, receiving raw materials, smelting them, organizing them, packing them properly, and then big ships return to China replete with raw materials, but already at least smeltered. Because let's understand what's going to cause in China. There is so much China can do. Providing the basics for the entire world is not an easy task. Try to understand what it takes then in terms of energy. Can you imagine only sending raw materials to China and let them do the smeltering? They wouldn't be able to breathe. However, when China establishes its Dragon Mart, it becomes then a derivative of these Dragon Mart for other areas, for instance, of smeltering, aluminum, iron, gold, silver, where China receives those already then packed properly. So the amount of jobs are absolutely nearly incalculable. You can't even calculate properly. And precisely these kinds of plans Mr. Putin wants to hear then in the Soviet Union. Leaders should never show up in the Soviet Union with a lavished face and no plans. They are going to be very awkward. You are going to sense you are then a lazy scoundrel. Not in words, but if you read the objectives, growth through quality jobs and investment. Second objective, growth through trust and transparency. And then third, growth through then obviously comprehensive regulation. Now let me ask you this, leaders showing up there with no plan, how are they going to be treated? As retarded. Because both militaries of China and the Soviet Union must be delineated. They have to understand whom are they working with, what are their partners, where they are at, how they're going to establish then trade lane and big ships, then post-Panamax, delivering then the products, coming back, where they're going to place their submarines. These must be defined. So expect a very strong delineation after this visit of the G20 in September. Expect the changes. We are during the time of the dragon. We are no longer mixing ourselves with the scoundrels, politicians. These people have no place in the world. These politicians, besides the dragon system, they are scoundrels of the worst kind. Watch what they have done with our economy. It's nearly ruined. So then why would Canada would want to have, for instance, the Dragon Mart up there? Obviously because the northwest route is opening and links up with the Soviet Union. So let's be aware of leaders of this G20 in September. They are not going to hear BS there. Try to understand from the last visit They used to deal with another type of country. They became the Soviet Union. Try to understand what went on last month. Because people don't want to hear the Soviets again. No, but this time they're going to be higher than the first. Read what Daniel has said. And the latest status of the Soviet Union higher than the first. The Northern Kingdom. Where do you find a Northern Kingdom with the military power of the past? Understandably, there is not even 20 years left of this age. What other Northern Kingdom could you understand? Understandably, the 11th chapter of Daniel requires your understanding of the time of the restoration period. Links up with the 61st chapter of Yeshayahu, chapter 1:8, Ezekiel 37th chapter. Then later with the Zechariah. And the Messiah said not a layer is going to be left undone. He never said not a word or, the design of Hebrew characters. He never spoke of those. He said not a layer of understanding is going to be left undone. Layer of understanding. So during this time of September, it is 100% related with the dragon market. No country, nation, or any kingdom of this world can't be outside of the dragon's market. What they want over there is countries serious, wanting to join the BRICS and adopting dragon market, making themselves as a trading post. So if you understand geographics, try to understand. Must I have a place in South Pacific? Must I have a place in South Atlantic? Must I have a place then in Northern Atlantic? And then in India? At least it would cover a great section of this planet. Have it in mind, we don't have a prophet yet. If we had a prophet from the Holy City, we would simply ask. And he would say precisely, but we don't have the prophet. So the most favorable country of this planet at the moment, besides the eastern, northern, and southern kingdoms, as per Daniel the 11th chapter, is Australia. Australia and Brazil, those are going to be hand to hand because of the mineral riches. Indian, lots of people with great labor, lots of laborers, quality laborers, but they don't have anymore the riches of mining, for instance. The Indian soil is very depleted. So the places they can compete, obviously, is Australia because of the number of islands near them, and they can make, obviously, trade with them. And then northern Brazil. But unfortunately, we do not have a prophet yet. That's why it's important having tabernacle on the land of Cush, as per the instruction of the prophet. So leaders of nations can come to the city and ask then the prophet. That's what they are there for. The rest of us can only go by the flow of the instructions, by the flow of the events, of the times and the seasons in geographical areas, as far as we can go. We can't be more specific because this specific is from the prophet. And there is not a prophet in this planet. but wilt be. Can be sure of it. Many of them are coming. So let's watch and be very, very, very concerned with September. September is the initiation of the BRICS system. Watch the objectives. First, growth through quality jobs and investment. Second, growth through trust and transparency. Growth through quality jobs and investment. Quality jobs. You have to have a change of the universities. Universities must provide the country with high quality workers, bound by the time and serve their countries. If you want to get an electrical diploma or then certification as a higher up, takes 10 years for you to study, 10 years you work as a technician. Thus, growth through quality jobs can be done only if the universities, they change the way they do. In New Zealand, it's not very smart. They provide the student with whatsoever is required, then they get their diploma and they leave the country. Then, where is the qualified labor? Gone. Growth through quality jobs and investment. Then comes only Dragon Mart. There is no other option. There is not best investment in this world other than the Dragon Market. It's the time of the dragon. Then growth through trust and transparency. Computer. High knowledge using computer. Did not Daniel spoke of it? And then growth through comprehensive regulation. That depends on how a person is then educated during the time of the vocational. These are the objectives. You can be sure of in September there won't be a club of friends. You know, this junkie situation, or invite these leaders for a party and they don't talk crap, but then they themselves act as crap. Because they say they do it, they don't do what they say they would do. This time is for real. The BRICS must be initiated, and seriously. Cancun's place, the Dragon Mart in Cancun, is more than 30% already completed. So leaders, prior of going September in the Soviet Union, they can take a trip then to Mexico and take a trip over there and have a nice walk at the Dragon Mart in Cancun. This is what these leaders of other countries should be doing. Visit with President Nieto and ask him for a tour. So then when they go to September, the Soviet Union and Northern Kingdom, they have their faces at least with a plan. Not show up like ghosts with absolutely no plan on their faces. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.